afternoon, Cairns. I know this is the graveyard shift and when it comes to keynote speaking, so I'm going to really try and rev you up. We're in beautiful Cairns in stunning Queensland, right near the absolutely awesome, in its literal meaning, Great Barrier Reef. You know, what is not to be excited about? Okay, so that's about as enthusiastic as I'm going to get for the next hour, because I've got some pretty serious messages to give you on the economy, unfortunately. But I'm going to try and leave you feeling upbeat, at least by the end, but you may have some dips during the next little while. Sorry about that in advance. So I've called this Riding the Waves because we are in turbulent times. It really is, you know, you don't know what's up and what's down at the moment, a bit like being in a dumper. We're just facing so many challenges, and it feels like I've been around for a very long time as an economist, and you know there are always challenges in the market, but it seems to me that we have just had, you know, wave after wave, dumper after dumper, accelerating in its frequency and the challenges that the world brings us. Part of that, of course, is because of increased globalisation, but also just perhaps the way our economies, particularly in the Western capitalist world, are developing and have the point that we have come to. So today I'm going to talk a little bit around what's happening in the global markets, because that's obviously so important for you, but also in terms of Australia as a small open economy. We're a little bit buffeted by the winds of the world. Then we'll get into the domestic economy and the key challenges we're facing. And then we'll get a bigger picture, bird's eye, of some of those really longer term themes that we need to think about, not just be in the moment and the crisis of the moment. And then perhaps some final thoughts to get onto the theme of resilience. So we'll start with those global economic conditions. And you might have heard in the news this morning that last night the Governor of the Reserve Bank, Michelle Bullock, was talking about how difficult things were with the inflation outlook, that business pricing perhaps was behind some of the inflationary pressures, and that in Australia we were less faced with the supply chain pressures on inflation rather than demand pressures. And clearly you can see from this chart here that the supply chain pressures that peaked very, very high during the COVID period have now in fact come back to far more normalised levels. So it is reasonable to say that supply chain pressures are more normalised. I would point out though that perhaps it hasn't made the headlines just because it's not sexy, but the El Nino this year has reduced water levels in the Panama Canal very severely, and that is also disrupting the traffic going through there in very severe ways, with repercussions right around the world. So we're not quite out of the woods yet, unfortunately. And of course, we responded to COVID with this massive monetary policy, lower interest rates and fiscal stimulus that kind of landed us in the trouble we're in with inflation today. But those are being more normalised. And you can see that back in 2020, we were in 2019, we were really had huge amounts of stimulus, both monetary and fiscal, from governments and central banks. Now that's completely reversed, and most economies, at least 3/4 of the economies around the world, are tightening both those policies. So we're moving to a phase to slow down the economies. And this is obviously, when you're trying to fight inflation and you do it using these tools, the only way you can do that is to slow the economy. There is no simple way out of it. The trade-offs, when you let that inflation genie out of the bottle, you basically people have to suffer, businesses have to suffer to get it back in. And it's going to be a tricky year ahead for all of us, including on the global front. So if we have a look at what's happening with inflation around the world, the good news is that particularly in the US, we are seeing inflation come right back down. It's not to their target, which is 2%. It's a little bit lower than our 2 to 3% range, but it's definitely coming back. It's coming back on the services front, which is critical, and we'll talk about that a bit in the Australian context in a minute. Not where it needs to be, but probably the tightening cycle around the world is at or very, very close to the end. And that's good news, that the sort of huge amount of tightening that we've seen over the past 12 months is taking effect, at least at a global level, by and large. And there's one exception to that, of course, and that is in China, where there is actually deflationary pressures. And of course, that is not a good thing. We need a little bit of inflation, not too much. It's a Goldilocks equation that we need just that little bit, but in the target band for Australia, 2 to 3, most places around the world, somewhere between 1 and 2. And in China, of course, we're seeing actual deflation. If you take out some of the more fluctuating prices and get back to core inflation, there's a lot going on with pork in China and pork prices. You then get a tiny, tiny bit of inflation. But what it suggests is that the Chinese economy is definitely slowing down. And of course, that's important not only for Australia, but the rest of the world. We can see that the Chinese economy, which has been so reliant on government spending, investment for such a long time, they've been talking for at least a decade about saying we need more consumers to come out. We need consumption to be a bigger part of our growth story. And of course, now at the moment, you've got the property sector in crisis. You've come out of COVID without a really big swing and a big bounce back in the way that you've seen in other countries. You've got consumers very pessimistic because of what's happened in the property sector. And that means that, China is always hard to read. We don't necessarily always believe the official stats, but even if you dig deep into the numbers, you will see that China is definitely slowing. And of course, this matters because China has become such an important part of the global economy. That rapid growth that we have seen, particularly in the last 2 decades, which has been so fantastic for Australia. It helped us really avoid the worst of that global financial crisis. But it's not just about the size of China as a proportion of the total economy, around 1/5, but it's about the fact that it grows that much faster, so contributing around 1/3 of total world GDP. So absolutely critical for the world, but also, of course, for Australia. And that means that, the prognosis for the outlook for the world in the year ahead, according to the IMF, is looking a little bit soft. Particularly, though, you can see from the chart on the numbers for advanced economies, much, much lower than for developing economies. So China will be slower than it normally is, but that's still close to 5%, maybe a little bit under. By Australian standards, that's a lot of growth, but it's still a lot slower than what we're used to. And that's going to flow through to all areas of the Australian economy, unfortunately. We talked about India, or it was spoken about just before lunch, so I won't go on about it, but it definitely is an incredibly important market. It's a very exciting country. There is so much happening there. There's a big growth trajectory still to happen. So even if China is on the wane, India, which still has very, very low GDP per capita, but it is definitely a market to watch. And beyond that, perhaps parts of the African continent as well, where young, dynamic populations with the great potential for growth as well. So that's the international outlook. A lot softer. There's some problems there. We know, of course, that geopolitics is playing a role here as well. In the headlines, we're a little bit more optimistic. Of course, the war in Ukraine is still continuing. No sign of that abating, unfortunately. Maybe some progress in the Middle East. Let's hope so. It's looking a little bit better. We know China, Taiwan is again an issue. And of course, just where you're not looking is always where the problem pops up. This matters because it tends to affect, when you get that global uncertainty, there is a direct correlation with uncertainty and investment. When levels of uncertainty are elevated, as you would expect, investment starts to decline. So again, we need to watch what's happening in the headlines. So what does this all mean for Australia? There are 3 big questions, I think, if you are curious like this owl. So, how sticky is inflation is the first question. And then, depending on your answer to that, is the tightening cycle over? Have we seen the last of interest rate rises in this country? And finally, given the amount of tightening that we've had already, can Australia avoid a recession? So, first question, how sticky is inflation? And you can see from this chart, of course, that inflation peaked really high. I put this chart in with a really long historical timeline so you can just see how good it's been in the last couple of, well, 3 decades really, but how volatile it was, particularly in the 70s and 80s, mainly due to oil price shocks, but also those led to wage price spirals. We've obviously been through something where there's been a huge amount of stimulus. We've had blockages in supply chains, and that's led to very high inflation. But you can see how sharply it rose, but also how it's starting to come down. Now, I would say that it's starting to come down quite quickly, but the Reserve Bank questions whether it's going to be quickly enough, and there's reasons for that. One of that is the distinction between the services sector and the goods sector of the economy. Originally, those supply chains were pushing goods prices up really strongly, much higher than services. That's now come down a long way, and in fact, services prices are going up much faster. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people are blaming the people in this room. In fact, there's a whole new term that's come out about the type of inflation that we've got at the moment, and it's called funflation, because people, where we're seeing price rises, are in things like the services that we have, whether it's going on cruises or on holidays, going out to eat at restaurants, even getting your hair done. Dentists are in there as well. I don't think that's part of funflation, but of course it is all part of that services sector. And perhaps some of that's driven by firmer demand that we've seen, certainly not driven by improvements in wages, but we'll get to that in a minute. But it's that stickiness in the services sector that is really concerning the policymakers at the moment. So I think we definitely need to be alert, not alarmed, to quote a former Prime Minister. You can see, though, from this chart, particularly where we've got the tourism, the holidays activity in the middle there, where how fast prices went when we had that bounce back. Because obviously after COVID, everyone, I mean, you're lucky, I'm from New South Wales, not quite as bad as the doom state of Victoria, but we had a lot more lockdowns than Queensland did, that's for sure. And we couldn't wait to get out of the state, and then when the time came to get out of the country. So, of course, we'd had all this pent-up demand. And, you know, that pent-up demand is the same for, you know, the poor hairdressers and dentists that got pointed to last night in the Governor's speech. You know, you couldn't get those things done during COVID, so of course there's a lot of demand out there. Of course those businesses that did it most tough, like tourism, have put their prices up to try and recoup some of those losses. That's exactly what you'd expect. But to the extent that that's fueling inflation, you know, we're going to keep seeing interest rates rises. But I think right across the board, the things that we're seeing that are more worrying, the things that continue to rise, things like rents, things like insurance, they're not things that monetary policy can control, by and large. In fact, if you raise interest rates, rental prices are going to get worse because fewer people will invest. You'll have even less supply for the demand that we have. And of course, that means prices, i.e. rents, go up. And of course, the other thing is what's happening with utility prices. There's always a lag in the market. We saw big increases in the cost of gas, coal, oil. All of that is feeding through into the electricity bills that we get now. But again, not something that interest rates, that monetary policy can do something about. So yes, we need to be watching this, but at the moment, we are still seeing service prices start, by and large, to move back in the right direction, albeit slowly. Now, we economists tend to talk about 2 types of inflation, wage push and demand pull. So on wage push, that is where wages are rising too fast, perhaps, and that feeds into prices. There is a small element of that happening. We saw the last wage price index went up by 4%, not exactly huge amount of, considering how tight the labour market is, but of course if you don't get productivity gains and offsets, and our productivity numbers are quite weak, then that means you're going to get inflation running at higher than the 2 to 3% target. So that's something the Reserve Bank is watching very carefully. But that last increase, that latest increase, was driven by a one-off for aged care workers and a one-off by the Fair Work Commission for lower minimum wage and award workers. Those numbers are very unlikely to be repeated. They certainly won't be repeated in the next 3 quarters before the next Commission decision. So we should start to see those pressures come down, which is really important. The other thing that's really interesting, and this is a very different audience. Sometimes when I talk to people in the financial services sector, they go, oh, but Nicki, we see 5 to 6% wage increases all the time. And what they're doing is extrapolating from what they see to what is in the wider economy. Now, this might look like, a 3-year-old's painting that was done on an afternoon when they were feeling tired. But what it's actually showing you is the proportion of people in the last, by the quarter, who get different types of wage increases. And what you can see, the top 2 lines, the purple lines there, are showing, yes, more people are getting bigger wage increases, but overall, there's still a big proportion that are getting smaller increases, relatively within the sort of 0 to 3%, and overall that amounts to 4% on average. So not something that we need to be worried about. Never extrapolate from individual experience, whether that's personal or business experience. I do think that pressure is coming off as well because, as I said, while the labour market is very, very tight at the moment, you can see how fast employment has been growing. The red line here shows you kind of the long-term trend line, and then the blue line is what's actually happening. So you can see employment has been growing well above trend. But, and across the states, we're seeing unemployment very low, a little bit higher in Queensland than other states, but still by historic standards, incredibly low. And I don't think this is likely to last. One, because we're starting to see a decline in job vacancies and in the ratio of job vacancies to available people. All of that's coming right down. And right across the board, whether it's underemployment or hours worked, that underutilisation, all of those things are starting to soften, not dramatically. But don't forget, we've still got tightening to come through the system. Just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it won't happen. So those things will lead to, I believe, softer wages outcomes in the quarters ahead. So in answer to the question about stickiness of inflation, are wages going to be a problem? The answer, I think, is no for the moment. So the other side is that demand pull, and that's what we're hearing the governor talk a lot more about, particularly who's spending what. We've seen this incredible increase in interest rates. You can see by historic standards, this is a very, very sharp rise. We actually have never had this much increase in interest rates in such a short period of time. Of course, it followed a period of ridiculously, abnormally low interest rates that were too low for too long. It's, hindsight's a wonderful thing, of course, but central banks around the world were caught short by what happened, by the amount of stimulus and by the level of recovery. They perhaps shouldn't, because the models predicted this would happen. So what has that done, in fact, to our spending? Well, the pressure is now on, of course, on fiscal policy, on the federal government to do more. And we've talked about, the Treasurer has talked about pulling back on spending on infrastructure and to try and ease some of the pressures. Because obviously the more you spend on building, whether it's roads or bridges or airports, that's more people required, that's more materials required. That does, if you do too much, too quickly, we obviously need to build the infrastructure. It's a critical part of our economic growth and productivity story, but we need to make sure that we're not doing it too quickly. You can see from this chart that spending had been at close to historic levels, close to where it was during the mining boom, but this time a lot more transport government-supported projects than it was in the mining boom. So the ability to pull back, and this is just the actual guaranteed approved projects. The ones in the pipeline are at least equal to that amount again. So you're talking about $1 trillion worth of potential projects. The whole size of the Australian economy is $2.5 trillion, right? That's a lot of infrastructure. Obviously, it's scheduled over many years, but still, that's a big stimulus. So that's coming back a bit, hopefully. Just having a look at what's happening to consumers, you can see that most consumers are tightening their belt. You have to look at any of the data that we've got. It's really interesting to look at Australia compared to other countries to think about how much we've been affected by those higher interest rates. You might have seen some commentary that says Australia hasn't tightened interest rates as much as other countries, certainly not the US or the UK, where they're over 5%. Here we're still in the low 4s. So we haven't, gone as far. But because Australians are so indebted, particularly through the cost, our housing is so unaffordable, it means that affects us more than it affects other countries. And particularly when you think of the US, where it's very easy to get a 30-year fixed loan. People I know there who've got, a 2-point-something% loan at the moment for 30 years, they're certainly not moving from their houses at the moment and having to refinance. If you move, you refinance, you suddenly jump from 2-point-something to 5-point-something, as people in Australia are doing when they move off a fixed rate loan onto a flexible rate loan. But Australia our tightening is really having an impact. And that has affected our ability to spend. You can see that household income has been weak, our spending has been weak, and really importantly, the savings that we built up. You often hear the Reserve Bank talking about this savings buffer, but that savings buffer, which got to an incredible 20-odd% of GDP, of household income rather, that's a massive amount of saving. We don't normally save that much as Australians. And our savings buffer has really been depleted. We're right back down to pretty well pre-COVID levels. So we don't have a lot extra when our real wages aren't growing to be able to spend. So who's got money? If you do, again, an international comparison, Australia's income has gone back by much more than many of our international similar countries with similar economies. So which of us have the most to spend? Now, unfortunately, the chart on the left, which shows you the rate of growth of spending by age group, I didn't have time to update it. There's just new data came out a couple of days ago. And the pattern by age is still very much the same, but what we're now seeing is that particularly the sort of under 40s, actually their spending has gone into the negative. And it's only the over 70s that have their spending growing faster than the rate of inflation, so faster than they're actually spending more, not just spending more because of prices, they're actually spending on more goods. But right across the board, people are starting to spend less. Older people who don't have a mortgage, who tend to have more savings, who tend to have higher incomes, of course they're going to be able to be more resilient to higher interest rates. The other thing that people are talking about, when they see these charts, then they go, oh, you old people are spending too much, stop going on holidays. But actually what we're seeing is that across the board, real spending is still going backwards, or certainly not moving forwards. So even though some older people might be spending a bit more, and it's, they're not spending it all, while they might be spending a bit on holidays, they also tend to spend a lot on things like health, for example. They are not the ones that are contributing to this demand that the Reserve Bank is seeing, because their spending is not as much as the younger people. So across the board, even though older people's spending is growing faster, still as an economy as a whole, it's still not going anywhere. What is contributing is tourism and international students. Those inflated numbers, the migration numbers, are the ones that are keeping demand going up. That's a really difficult question for the federal government to answer then. It's like, we obviously want to support the tourism industry. We need to support the education industry. We need to have people coming in and helping with the tight jobs market. But that is also fueling inflation. And that's the thing with economics, it just shows you how difficult the challenges are. When you create one opportunity, it often comes at a cost on some other side of the equation. There is some positive stimulus still in the economy in the form of house prices. There is something called the wealth effect. When house prices go up, for those people that are lucky enough to own one, 2/3 of the population, even when you have a mortgage, we tend to feel a lot happier. And it's not just, of course, about the rate of change in house prices, but it's very important about where the level of house price is. Perhaps to everyone's surprise, given how much we've seen interest rates rise, we are now seeing house prices in 80% of Australian markets back above pre-COVID levels. So that is a problem for the Reserve Bank, and one they might think about. But overall, when you think about how slow demand is, how tough people are doing, how much we still haven't seen the full impact of interest rate rises, because still around half of the population has fixed rate mortgages that have yet to come off, there is a lot of downward pressure that we are yet to see. Demand is already soft, it's going backwards per capita. So in terms of the question, how sticky is inflation, I think the answer is that, much like Pooh's honey pot, the stickiness won't last. And that we basically will see inflation come down quite quickly, perhaps more quickly than the Reserve Bank thinks, which they've got it back in the target band at the start of 2025. I suspect it'll get there before the end of next year. So, if inflation is not as sticky as we think, is the tightening cycle done? I was at a recent lunch with the former Reserve Bank governor. It was his final speech. And when answered this question, he said, "I don't have a crystal ball." Now, that's a pretty bold statement for the governor of the Reserve Bank to make. You think he'd at least pretend that the economic models make a lot of sense. But it just goes to show, in all seriousness, how much uncertainty there is. And you see this in statements from the Reserve Bank. They don't really know how consumers are going to behave. Will they pull back even more? Businesses are investing a bit at the moment because there's been a bit of stimulus there. Will that be pulled back? You know, where's the government going with its fiscal policy? Where is the global economy happening? What's happening with geopolitics? There's a heightened degree of uncertainty. But if you look at what's the prognosis for slower demand will lead to slower inflation, there is no doubt about it. I think it will be relatively fast. The big question now for the Reserve Bank is, what's the next inflation number? The last one we had surprised to the upside. We get the next quarterly one, which is the one that matters most, at the end of January. If that is more than around 4.5%, which is what's built into their forecast, then you can expect one more rate rise. So everybody, I think it's the 28th or 29th of January, I've forgotten the exact date off the top of my head, but it's something for everyone to watch. There will be monthly numbers coming out before then, including one for next week, for October. Those monthly numbers are not that accurate though, but let's hope they give us a more positive signal. So then a third question, can Australia avoid a recession? Now this is a chart that shows the Reserve Bank's own forecasts for inflation and for growth. And what it shows you is the margin of error in their forecasts. And you can see that in the wider margin of error, yes, we could grow more strongly, but the downside risks are, to me, and to I think most economists, much higher. So there is a non-negligible risk of us falling into a recession in the year ahead. It depends what you mean by recession, though. We've already there are different measures, and in fact, in the first 2 quarters of this year, GDP per capita declined. So we kind of had a recession on that measure, even though GDP itself continued to grow, albeit very slowly and below trend, contributing to rising unemployment over the year ahead. You know, we are, even if it's not going backwards, it's very, very soft. I think what most people think of when they think of a recession, they're talking more about the rate of unemployment. The central forecast of the Reserve Bank is now they've pulled it down to go to 4.25%. It's currently 3.7%. I suspect that's probably a little bit optimistic. And certainly if they tighten interest rates again in the new year, we can expect something closer to 4.5% to closer to 5% even on the unemployment rate. Unemployment will rise in the year ahead. And that's really, really tough. There will be maybe 100,000 people who will lose their jobs so that 26 million people don't face higher prices at the supermarket or the dentist. It's a difficult equation, but unfortunately that's what we have to look at. So if they have to raise again to beat inflation, if it's not coming down quickly enough, certainly we're going to face a slowing economy and we can't rule out the R word. But I promised you I was going to leave you with some optimism. So I'm not going to have a quick word on the dollar. The dollar's not doing very well, but that's good for you because it makes it too expensive to go overseas. I just want to quickly talk about some bigger picture issues. We've got something called white rhinos, which are the big trends that are coming our way. These things are based on what the CSIRO says, but you can look at the intergenerational report, you can look at the World Economic Forum and see what they survey thousands of CEOs around the world. And these are all the issues we're grappling with, things that you've talked about, whether it's climate change, something very close to my own heart, whether it's talking about AI and data and how we use those as both a force for good, for great productivity growth, but also potentially as a dark force that we don't necessarily fully understand. And thinking about, obviously, the human economy. You heard the Minister just talk about the ageing population, about greater inclusion in our society. And it really heartens me that to see how much work is being done by this industry, that I think, as 3% of Australia's economy is doing so much to be inclusive and to be sustainable. It really is fantastic. But as much as we can see these white rhinos coming at us, there are also going to be the black swans that we, the things we don't know to look for, and also the green swans, which is the climate related. If you looked at the start of the year, the things that were worrying people at that World Economic Forum, pretty well 8 out of 10 all related to the environment, climate, biodiversity. That's the thing that everybody is really stressing about. We've got the COP28 conference, of course, coming around starting next week. That will be really important. We're hearing new announcements from the government. The transition absolutely has to happen. And the more every single industry does their bit, the better off we will all be. It's really hard in these times. You're dealing with cost of living, you're dealing with global uncertainty. How do you put all this together and think beyond the day-to-day of your business and think about how you're going to deal with these broader issues? Because you cannot be lost in the moment, and you cannot be fearful of the moment either. You have to have those strategies in place. What's your scenario planning look like? How do you plan for the worst but hope for the best? And I want to finish with a quote from the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, when he released the intergenerational report that I think sums up the kind of approach that I think we should take, which is that the best leaders amongst us focus on more than one thing, more than one time horizon, and more than one set of opportunities. There's another saying from the Economist magazine many, many years ago that Australia is a poor manager of prosperity. We have the everything's great, she'll be right, but we are good managers of adversity. And we saw this around the world, the way we came together in COVID. I believe we can do the same on the climate crisis. I believe we can do the same in these difficult economic times, but we do need to pull together. We need to improve that global trust that is very fractured at the moment. But if we do that, human beings are capable of so much. And at the end of the day, those human beings are every one of us in this room. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicki. And if you've just got a moment for a couple of questions, just to, I know we have some government people in the room today. You're mentioning that there is pressure on the government to do more and mentioned the infrastructure, pulling back on that spending. Is there anything that you can say or point to at this point that the government, what else they should be doing, or a priority from your perspective and from the perspective of this industry?
Yeah. So, look, I think governments, it's really, really hard, because if they spend too much, they will be criticised. I mean, not every government is in as good a shape as the Queensland government. We don't all have those royalties coming in. But of course, at some point in time, we have to be weaned off those royalties, unfortunately, because the cost of them in terms of climate change is very problematic. But in the short term, balancing budgets for most governments, and certainly the Commonwealth government, has to be a priority. They cannot add to the inflationary problem. That said, thinking about targeted spending that helps those who are disadvantaged without sort of putting fuel on the fire around the economy, pulling back on some of those infrastructure projects, and not necessarily canning the ones that make sense, but just saying we have to go a little bit slower on them. They can help there, but targeted spending to those most in need, thinking about the transition and planning for that, because that affects every sector of the economy, and helping to grow the sectors like tourism. I think, we heard the strategy earlier on. I mean, my goodness, I'm very critical of governments often, but wow, 10 out of 10, really. The thing with government strategies is then how do you take a strategy and put it into action? And that's what we need to see, whether it's climate, whether it's the tourism sector, whether it's any sector of our economy, whether it's the transition of our vehicle fleet, making sure that we get our tourists being able to travel around on, especially not just grey nomads, but everybody wanting to do the beautiful drive up and down the east coast of Australia, being able to do it in electric or hybrid vehicles, being able to charge their EVs. So there's a lot of decisions that government needs to make. But, you know, there are ministers, there are departments for every single issue that we face. So, you know, they can do it if they want, and I think we're seeing some good action at the moment.
And just briefly, there's been so much talk about 2032. So is that too far out for you to be saying where we're going and how we're getting there?
Not at all. You know, we have to think, as I said, beyond where we are in the first year. So, you know, 2032, what would I like to see? You know, we've gone past the 2030 targets for our energy system will be more than 80% renewable energy. We will be developing, you know, leading the world as I love that phrase, global renewable energy superpower. We'll be working out how to transition our green metals manufacturing and processing. We'll have critical minerals industry as the world's envy. We'll be training our people better to meet the jobs of the future, whether it's in the tourism sector or it's in some sort of AI or technology more broadly. You know, making sure that we have the strengths in place to deal with the challenges, including cybercrime and technological failure, making sure our critical infrastructure is there. And Australia will once again be a lucky country and a leader, because we have been in the past and we've kind of slipped on a lot of measures. And we will also be, one final point, embracing the wellbeing budget so that we are not just thinking about the dollars and cents of GDP, but thinking about the well-being of all of our citizens. Are we dealing with the big social issues, homelessness, domestic and family violence, mental health issues? How are we overcoming those challenges which face so many Australians? Inclusion, particularly for our First Nations people, making sure they are on a more equal footing. These are the challenges that we have to rise to meet, and I would love to be here in 10 years' time saying, yes, look how well we've done.
I'm sure it would be great. Thank you so much for bringing out the crystal ball. Nicki Hutley, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.